He was once the most feared man on the planet. A single punch from him could end a fight in seconds, could end a man's consciousness before the crowd even finished screaming. He was 20 years old when he became the youngest heavyweight champion in history, and for a moment, it seemed like nothing on earth could touch him. Not opponents, not doubt, not time itself. And then, piece by piece, the man who could not be hit was undone by everything a punch could never reach. Not because his body failed him. His body was, for a decade, the most dangerous instrument in sports. But because underneath the fists and the ferocity was a boy who had never stopped being afraid, and no championship belt was ever going to change that. How does a man become so feared that grown opponents trembled before the bell even rang? What did it cost him to build a wall of violence around a childhood built on none? And why, after losing his fortune, his freedom, and the people he loved most, did he keep getting back up? To understand Mike Tyson, you have to go back to a place most of the world would rather not look at. Not the arenas, not the championship belts. A cramped apartment in Brooklyn, in a neighborhood so violent that survival itself was considered an accomplishment. Brownsville, Brooklyn, in the 1970s was not simply poor. It was a place where poverty had teeth, where the sound of gunfire was as ordinary as traffic, and where a child's chances of reaching adulthood without a police record were slim to non-existent. Michael Gerard Tyson was born there on June 30th, 1966. The youngest of 3 children raised largely by his mother, Lorna, after his father left before Michael could form a single memory of him. Lorna worked what jobs she could find, but the family moved constantly, evicted more than once, sliding from one crumbling apartment to another. There was no stability. There was no safety net. There was only the block, and the block did not forgive weakness. Michael was small for his age, soft-spoken, and by his own later admission, terrified almost constantly. He wore glasses. He had a lisp. In a neighborhood where the wrong look could get a boy beaten senseless, he was, in his own words, the perfect target. Older kids mocked him, robbed him, humiliated him in ways that left marks no one could see. He remembers one incident with particular clarity, bigger boys stealing one of his pigeons and killing it in front of him, laughing while he wept. Something in him broke that day, and something else replaced it. He fought back for the first time, and won, and discovered a truth that would define the rest of his life. Fear could be answered with violence, and violence, however briefly, made the fear stop. By 10 years old, he was stealing. By 11, he had been arrested multiple times, cycling in and out of juvenile facilities that were less about rehabilitation and more about containment. By 13, he had been arrested nearly 40 times and was sent to the Tryon School for Boys, a juvenile reform facility in upstate New York, a place built for kids the system had already decided it could not save. He was, by his own later description, one of the most violent and troubled children the counselors had ever processed. Nobody looking at Michael Tyson at 13 years old would have predicted a heavyweight champion. They would have predicted a life sentence or an early grave. But inside that reform school was a counselor named Bobby Stewart, a former boxer who ran an amateur boxing program to give the boys something to do with their aggression besides destroy each other. Stewart noticed something in the way Michael moved, the way he hit, not just hard, but with an instinct, a rhythm that could not be taught. He made Michael a deal, behave, and Stewart would take him to meet someone who trained real fighters. That someone was Cus D'Amato, an aging trainer living above his gym in Catskill, New York, a man who had already built 2 world champions and had spent his life believing that boxing could save boys the world had already given up on. The first time Cus watched Michael Tyson hit the heavy bag, he reportedly turned to the men beside him and said, quietly, that he was looking at the future heavyweight champion of the world. Michael was 13 years old, weighed barely 190 pounds, and had never had a single professional fight. But Cus did not just see a fighter. He saw a wound. And he understood, in a way almost no one else in Michael's life ever had, that the two were connected, that the same terror that had made this child steal and fight and destroy could be reshaped, disciplined, aimed. Cus did not simply train him, he took him in. When Michael's mother died in 1982, when he was just 16 years old, Cus became his legal guardian, effectively raising him for the final and most critical years of his adolescence. For the first time in his life, Michael Tyson had a home that did not move, a man who believed in him without conditions, and a purpose that gave his rage somewhere to go besides prison. Cus's methods were part psychology, part mythology. He drilled into Michael not just technique, but belief, told him repeatedly that he was destined for greatness, that fear was not something to defeat but something to use, a source of power rather than a source of shame. He built an entire mental architecture inside a frightened boy from Brownsville, one designed to make him utterly unafraid inside a ring, even as Cus privately worried and later admitted to friends that Michael's demons ran deeper than boxing could ever fully address. Michael turned professional in 1985 at 18 years old, and what followed was one of the most devastating starts to a career the sport had ever witnessed. Fight after fight ended in the first round. Opponents who had trained for months collapsed within minutes, sometimes within seconds. He fought with a controlled violence that looked less like sport and more like retribution, as though every man across the ring from him was standing in for every bully, every eviction notice, every moment of humiliation from Brownsville. Crowds that came expecting boxing left, describing something closer to witnessing a natural disaster. Then, in November 1985, less than a year before Michael would become champion, Cus D'Amato died of pneumonia. He was 77 years old, and he never got to see his prediction come true. Michael Tyson, 20 years into a life defined by abandonment, had lost the one person who had ever given him unconditional structure, and he lost him standing at the very edge of the greatness Cus had spent years insisting was coming. Those close to him would say later that something in Michael narrowed after that. The man who had held together not just his career but his psychology was gone, and what remained was raw talent with no one left to steer it. 11 months later, in November 1986, 20-year-old Mike Tyson knocked out Trevor Berbick to become the youngest heavyweight champion in history. The image was broadcast around the world. A young man who months earlier had been an orphaned teenager from one of America's most dangerous neighborhoods, now standing at the top of the most brutal sport on earth. It should have been the beginning of an unshakable dynasty. Cus had always said Michael would be the youngest and the most dominant heavyweight champion the world had ever seen, and for a few years, he was exactly that. But fame, once it arrived in full, did not simply reward Michael Tyson. It exposed every crack that Cus's structure had been holding together. Without Cus, Michael's inner circle filled quickly with people whose interests did not always align with his well-being. Don King, the fight promoter who would become one of the most controversial figures in boxing history, moved into Michael's life with practiced charm and a gift for making himself indispensable. Over the years that followed, Michael would earn what is estimated at over $400 million in his career, one of the largest sums any athlete has ever earned. And yet somehow, piece by piece, decision by decision, deal by deal, that fortune would not simply diminish, it would vanish. In 1988, at 21 years old, Michael married actress Robin Givens in a wedding covered breathlessly by the press. The marriage, from the outside, looked like the final proof that the champion had arrived. Money, fame, a Hollywood wife. From the inside, it disintegrated almost immediately into one of the most publicly disastrous marriages in celebrity history, marked by allegations of instability, volatility, and a televised interview in which Givens, sitting beside Michael, described their marriage as torture, pure hell, worse than anything I could possibly imagine, while Michael sat beside her in visible, silent distress. The marriage ended within a year. It was the first widely public sign that the man who could not be beaten in the ring was struggling to hold together anything outside of it. The years that followed his divorce brought a slow, then rapid, unraveling. His performances in the ring began showing cracks that had nothing to do with talent, Inconsistency, erratic behavior, a growing sense that the discipline Cus had built into him was eroding under the weight of an entourage, a fortune, and a grief he had never processed. In 1990, in one of the greatest upsets in boxing history, he lost his heavyweight title to Buster Douglas, a fighter given almost no chance of winning. The invincibility that had defined his entire public identity, the thing Cus had spent years constructing, cracked in a single fight. And 2 years later, in 1992, the collapse became total and public in a way no championship loss ever could. Mike Tyson was convicted of raping Desiree Washington, an 18-year-old beauty pageant contestant, following an encounter in an Indianapolis hotel room. He was sentenced to 6 years in prison and served 3. The conviction, which he denied then and continued to deny for the rest of his life, ended the version of Mike Tyson the public had known. The heavyweight champion of the world, the youngest ever, the man Cus had raised from a terrified child into a destroying force, was now a convicted felon serving time in the Indiana Youth Center. He would later describe those prison years as some of the strangest and most introspective of his life, reading philosophy, converting to Islam, trying, in fragments, to understand who he had become and how he had arrived there. He was released in 1995 and returned to boxing almost immediately, the public curious but wary, the sport eager for the revenue his name still commanded. He won his early comeback fights, but the man in the ring was visibly different, heavier, angrier, less controlled. And in June 1997, in a rematch against Evander Holyfield, that anger detonated in front of the entire world. Frustrated and, by his own later account, enraged after what he believed were repeated illegal headbutts from Holyfield that referees ignored, Tyson bit off a piece of Holyfield's ear in the ring, spat it onto the canvas, and was disqualified in one of the most infamous moments in the history of American sports. His boxing license was revoked. Late-night comedians built entire monologues around the image. The heavyweight champion who had once seemed destined for legendary status had become, in the span of a single fight, a punchline and a cautionary tale simultaneously. What the public did not see clearly in that moment, and would only understand years later, was how far the wheels had already come off behind the scenes. Despite earning hundreds of millions of dollars across his career, Mike Tyson filed for bankruptcy in 2003, reporting debts of roughly $23 million against assets that had once seemed limitless. The money had gone to mansions, to a private zoo of exotic animals, including Bengal tigers, to a fleet of luxury cars, to an entourage that numbered in the dozens, to a divorce settlement from his second marriage to Monica Turner, and to advisors and promoters who had, by his own repeated accounts in later interviews, taken far more than their share while he was too consumed by fame, addiction, and grief to notice. The man who had once been the highest-paid athlete on the planet stood in a courtroom admitting he had nothing left. And underneath the financial collapse was a deeper one. Tyson had developed a serious cocaine addiction that ran for years, one he later described candidly in interviews and in his own memoir as nearly fatal on more than one occasion. He spoke about waking up in cars he did not remember getting into, about episodes of violence and depression that friends and family struggled to reach him through, about a decade in which he was, by his own description, barely present in his own life, even as cameras continued to follow him. Then, in 2009, came a loss that even he would later say was the only thing that ever truly broke him. His 4-year-old daughter, Exodus, was found unconscious in his home, entangled in a cord from an exercise treadmill. She died days later in the hospital. Tyson, who had survived poverty, prison, public humiliation, and financial ruin without ever fully collapsing, has said in multiple interviews since that Exodus's death was the one wound he was never certain he would recover from. He has described sitting in the hospital, holding her, understanding for the first time in his adult life what it meant to lose something he could not fight his way back to. It would have been entirely understandable if that had been the end of the story, another cautionary tale of a man broken by fame, buried under grief and addiction, remembered only for what he lost. But somewhere in the years that followed, something in Mike Tyson began, slowly and imperfectly, to rebuild. He got sober, crediting his fourth wife, Lakeha Spicer, and the birth of their children with giving him a reason to fight for his life rather than simply survive it. In 2012, he brought a one-man show, Mike Tyson, Undisputed Truth, to Broadway, standing alone on a stage with no opponent, no entourage, no mythology to hide behind, narrating his own life with a rawness that stunned audiences who had only ever known him as a fighter. Critics who arrived expecting spectacle left describing something closer to confession. He built a podcast, Hotboxin' with Mike Tyson, that became one of the most listened to interview shows in the world, turning the man once defined by inarticulate rage into a surprisingly reflective, often gentle interviewer known for genuine curiosity about the guests across from him. He built a cannabis business, Tyson Ranch, reinventing himself yet again as an entrepreneur in an industry he once would have gone to prison for touching. In 2020, at 54 years old, he stepped into a boxing ring for an exhibition match against Roy Jones Jr. Not for a title, not for redemption in the eyes of the sport, but seemingly for himself, a reminder, perhaps most of all to Mike Tyson, that the fire Cus D'Amato had once seen in a frightened 13-year-old had never fully gone out. Now, at 60 years old, Mike Tyson lives a life almost unrecognizable from the chaos of his 20s and 30s. He speaks openly, sometimes with startling vulnerability, about therapy, about the psychedelic treatments he is credited with, helping him process trauma he spent decades running from, about the specific ache of having been, in his own words, a scared little boy who learned that violence was the only language that made people listen. He talks about his children, about the ones he has lost, and the ones he is determined to be present for in a way his own father never was for him. He has spoken about Exodus, not as a wound sealed over, but as one he carries deliberately, unhealed in places, because he believes some griefs are not meant to fully close, only to be carried with more grace over time. His fortune today is a fraction of what it once was, rebuilt slowly through business ventures, media appearances, and a public willing to watch a complicated man attempt an honest reckoning rather than demanding a clean redemption story. He does not ask to be forgiven for everything. In interviews, he has been unflinching about the harm in his past, including addressing his rape conviction and the pain he caused Robin Givens and others without the polished evasion celebrities often deploy. What he asks, instead, is to be understood as a whole person, the terrified boy in Brownsville, the destroying force in the ring, the broken man in a courtroom, the father burying a daughter, and the 60-year-old still trying, every day, to be someone Cus D'Amato would recognize as more than just a fighter. Perhaps that is the truth Mike Tyson's life leaves behind, more than any championship belt or bankruptcy filing or headline ever could. That the same ferocity that can make a man the most feared person on the planet can also, unchecked and unhealed, become the exact force that destroys everything he built. That talent is never a substitute for a childhood a person never got to have. And that redemption, when it comes at all, rarely arrives as a single triumphant moment. It arrives slowly, in the form of a man standing alone on a stage, or sitting across from a stranger on a podcast, or holding a memory of a daughter he could not save, choosing every single day to keep telling the truth instead of running from it. If Mike Tyson's story has made you think differently about the price of greatness, leave a like, share this story, and subscribe for more untold chapters of the lives that shaped our world. Because some legends are not remembered for how hard they could hit. They are remembered for how long it took them to stop swinging at themselves, and how, even now, they are still standing.